Good evening from Iford Manor, where it's a splendid evening and we're surrounded by the scent and the flowers of the Wisteria sinensis. Such an important feature at Iford, and I thought it might be a nice opportunity to sneak into the garden and have a look at some of the plants. Now, of course, Wisteria came to the UK in 1816, brought here by John Reeves, and he brought a whole load of clippings. He was the head of the tea station in Canton, which is today Guangzhou in China. And the wisteria on the front of the house is thought to be one of the earlier wisterias in the country, so probably pre-1835. By that point, there were cuttings selling for 2 shillings, so it was quite prevalent across the country and a particularly important feature of people's gardens. On the other side here, you have Harold Peato's wonderful wisterias placed here in around 1903. And as you go through the gate, look to your left and you'll see the stump of the wisteria poking its way through the wall, where Harold created a buttress to the house in order to support the building. But the wisteria was there first, and a great believer in the vernacular and what existed before, he left the extant plant to go through the wall. A great respect for age. The loggia, which you see here, adorned by the wisteria, is built out of Westwood stone, mined just in the hillside that you see ahead of you. And that stone is a particularly important feature of Iford because it has a seam of a sparkling gold seam, a mica, I believe, running through it, which gives it a sort of glint in the sunshine. Heading up the steps, you start to get a glimpse of the wisteria at the top around the great lily pond. We'll go there in a second, but first we're going to scoot up and around to some of the other plants in the garden. As you come to the top of the steps and you look up, you see the great plane tree planted in 1779 at the top of the terrace, and it gives this sense of an extraordinary height to the hillside above, and below the temple area on the great terrace and the wisteria around the pond. It's a wonderful display of colour, late May, early June, and it gives me a lot of happiness every time I see it. The Japanese wisteria, adorning the little patio garden that Peato created at the end of his rose terraces, is redolent of those visits to the south of Spain, a Cordoban patio with a little trickle of water and pots. And later in the summer, well, after the frost risk is gone, we plant this up with geraniums, pelargoniums and scented plants, which gives a really warm sun trap and a scent after the wisteria is finished flowering. One of our favourite wisterias at Iford, planted by Harold Peato behind his statue of the wolf Romulus and Remus, is this almost semi-double wisteria with its extremely delicate fronds and a lovely delicate purple centre. There's something particularly soft and effeminate about this plant as it climbs up the columns in a very kind of nymph-esque, light-hearted way. A very frivolous wisteria compared to some of the more structural ones. Which brings us up to the great terrace, which at this time of year is perhaps at its best in some ways, because you have the combination of the wisteria and the alliums, the honesty, the sedum starting to come out, and it really gives this sense of the whimsical, particularly the white honesty, which this year has been particularly prolific, you might say. The wisteria there again on the column, a sort of soft foil for the structure of the false junipers behind. Up to the casita, which originally was a donkey shed, and you get a sense of how wisteria can be used as a sort of sunshade. A lovely architectural feature balancing the solid structure of the building on the left with something a little softer on the right, and behind it and below it a small tank. Looking back towards the terrace, you get a sense of how wisteria can be used to balance a view. On the right, still looking through to the softer semi-double, and here a classic Wisteria sinensis of the original form planted by Harold Peato to give some structure to the garden. And again, it gives this idea that wisteria can be a plant, a structure in its own right, almost a sculptural feature. And it doesn't just have to be an addition to a building or a column or a structure. back onto the terrace, and you get the view looking out to the countryside. The Great Terrace was a sort of evocation of the Appian Way, so it's all about the borrowed landscape looking out from the city to the countryside, from the managed to the unkempt. And the wisteria, again, giving that sense of age and that sense of respectability. People often ask about pruning wisteria. Of course, the main prune for a wisteria would be in late winter, and we would aim to take, say, 30 to 50% of the new growth out of a plant, if not a little more, with the older plants where the structure of the plant is set. We like to, well, I personally like to take the little dead bits off with my fingers, because I find it a lot easier to feel what's alive and what's dead with my fingers rather than a pair of secateurs. And then all of the old growth spikes that need to come off, and any diseased or dying, and the crossing branches, take it all out and leave it as a nice open structure ready for flowering next year. If you want to prune for the sort of the summer, for a bit of an ornamental pruning, a growth spike like this, you might take it back in order to, just after the main flowering's finished, take it back, and then that will help to keep its shape. And you may need to do that every 2 or 3 weeks through the summer as it starts to try to climb over other buildings, your car, your garage, or whatever. Here's a beautiful example of a whimsical wisteria. I love this. The temple area, this beautiful capital at the top of the column, and the detailing under the entablature, and then this wisteria sitting underneath just saying, I'm here, it's okay. It's almost like an architectural sort of completion of a work. Let's go down to the great pond where we finish our little whimsical tour of wisterias. There's something about this view across the lily pond with the cloister in the distance, Harold Pito's most important building, created in 1914 as a haunt of ancient peace. And I think this sort of setting here really gives that sense of an ancient peace, the peacefulness that only exists after many generations of people have been trying to create something beautiful and something unique. And the wisteria around the pond here would have been a part of a wider sort of design, but actually this pond originally was Victorian, if not earlier, so Harold Pito was creating something to augment something previously extant. And just taking a minute to soak up the peaceful atmosphere of the garden, you get a real sense for what an English idyllic summer evening can produce. Well, if you've made it this far, thank you for watching, and I hope you'll subscribe to get more anecdotes, tips and tricks, behind the scenes tours and other news from Iford as we roll through the summer and into the winter months. And of course, all the latest from the @IfordCats.